Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Queen's Gallery at Buckingham Palace. Under normal circumstances, I'd be welcoming you in real time and in person, but due to current restrictions, we are sadly unable to host a gathering in our beautiful new exhibition, Masterpieces from Buckingham Palace. I do hope that this short film, which includes a tour of the exhibition in the company of Desmond Shaw-Taylor, Surveyor of the Queen's Pictures, and Isabella Manning, Assistant Curator of Paintings, will encourage you to visit the gallery in person. We're extremely privileged to care for a truly extraordinary collection of Dutch, Flemish and Italian Old Master paintings on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen. This exhibition brings together 65 of the most celebrated works that normally live next door in the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace, one of just 19 splendidly appointed staterooms of the palace. The picture gallery, as we know it today, was created as part of the remodelling of the palace by George IV, the subject of the previous exhibition here in the gallery. This space was intended to display the King's magnificent collection of Dutch paintings. However, its origins could be traced back to the arrangement of pictures in Buckingham House by George's parents, King George III and Queen Charlotte. Their mix of Dutch, Flemish and Italian works continues to influence the hang in the picture gallery to this day. During Queen Victoria's reign, the picture gallery was open to the public when the royal family was not in residence. Today it can usually be enjoyed as part of the summer opening of Buckingham Palace. This exhibition has been made possible by the removal of the pictures from the picture gallery to prepare for the next phase of the resurfacing project. This major 10-year project is overhauling the palace's essential services, including lead pipes, aging electrical wiring and boilers, to ensure the building is fit for the future as the official residence of the sovereign and as a national asset for generations to come. As you'll shortly hear, this presents a unique opportunity to release the pictures from their historic and traditional context, to look at them close up and in fresh ways, and ask the question, what is a masterpiece? To pose that question and suggest some possible answers, I hand you over to the exhibition's curators, Desmond and Isabella.
All the paintings in this room, in the heart of the exhibition, were created in Italy. So we begin with paintings from the Italian Renaissance, in particular Venetian portraits on this wall here. And then in the next century, in the 17th century, the age of Baroque, we have these examples of Italian Baroque history subject paintings. And this is where you really get the advantage of seeing them here in the Queen's Gallery rather than in the picture gallery in the state apartments at Buckingham Palace, because there they're hung at a higher level, at an upper tier, and here we are able to bring them down to eye level and put them in this stronger lighting. So you can really see the drama of the expressions and the brilliance of the technique. The later period of Italian painting is also on show in this room in the work of Canaletto, in particular these four large upright format early Canaletto views of Venice. And here again, the opportunity of getting them down at eye level really allows you to see the exciting paint technique that Canaletto uses.
Masterpieces have been displayed at Buckingham Palace since the residence was acquired as Buckingham House in 1762 by George III and Queen Charlotte. It was intended as a domestic retreat away from formal court life at St. James's Palace, and the thoughtful, careful painting displays reflected this function. Hanging plans, which still exist in the print room at Windsor, attest to this care, with the King's own annotations and suggestions as to where paintings should hang. The royal couple incorporated paintings from three different sources. The first was the newly inherited royal collection. The second was new acquisitions, such as these Canalettos, acquired from the collection of Joseph Smith, British consul in Venice. And the third was from the King's father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, where all but one of these paintings were acquired from, except for the Guercino. And this wall reflects the original displays at Buckingham House, with a combination of ideal classical landscapes and Baroque history subjects. In this painting of Athene by Parmigianino, we're introducing the importance of the ideal in Italian art. So that's not just a depiction of nature, but nature embellished by art. And that was often informed by a classical ideal of beauty. And we see that in effect here, with her elongated, stylized features, her lengthened nose, oval eyes, and perfect lips, and in these elongated fingers, which point to her breastplate, with a brooch, with the figure of victory flying over Athens, and an inscription, Athene, and this identifies the goddess. And there's a wonderful quality of light in this painting.
And I think I've always found the expression of these sorts of paintings in a way quite difficult to read, because it's not an extrovert kind of expression. It is enigmatic and slightly impassive in a way. And I guess that's the light, or perhaps more importantly, the shadow, the softness of the shadow which veils the...
Absolutely. Her face seems to recede into this very dark background. And in fact, Parmigianino made changes to the composition to, I think, make her expression more enigmatic. Originally, she was looking further out to the viewer, and he changed the position of her eyes so that she's looking further down. And despite this recession into the darkness, there is a wonderful clarity of light, particularly in her breastplate and in the curls of her hair, where he uses a really small brush to add bright white and yellow highlights, and it gives an effect of almost spun gold. So we move from this classical ideal to a much more restrained, realistic in many ways portrait. This is Jacopo Sanazzaro by Titian. It's the earliest painting in the exhibition. And we see the artist treating the canvas in a way a bit like a draftsman, with a complete economy of materials. The background, his clothes, are almost completely monochrome, and we have touches of colour in his face, outlining the contours of his face, and also in his book. Colour connects the source of contemplation, i.e. the book, to the result, a learned man, learned, thoughtful man.
And I love the way you have this, Titian has these, this is something like colour coding. This is a grey painting. This is in this sort of very limited, controlled kind of colour range. And then there'll be another one which will be a scarlet painting, also brilliantly coloured.
Absolutely. It seeps into his complexion here, this grey into his neck, where finally the colour starts to take over.
And I always look, I find myself looking at these sort of from 17th century eyes and imagining what Rubens would be looking at, or
Velázquez.
Or Velázquez, exactly. It's so, and I think he's sort of neater and sharper than any of them. He's got that kind of clarity in his drawing with the brush. Absolutely,
and that individualizes his sitter. I think we get a real sense of Sanazzaro as a man, even though there's little embellishment around him. And I think that makes quite a strong contrast to this painting of Andrea Odoni by Lorenzo Lotto, telling us quite a lot about this man. Firstly, with his quite overbearing expression and outstretched arm, saying, "Come on, you better listen to me." He's surrounded by examples of classical statues that we assume to have been in his collection. Andrea Odoni was a Venetian merchant, a collector of sculpture, coins, and gems. And we get a very clear idea of not only his personality, but also his activity as a collector.
Yeah, and you get this amazing thing of some portraits don't just deal with the head and then kind of do the fade out at the edges. They do exactly the opposite. The painting becomes almost more dense and active in the corners than in the centre.
And Lotto's adapted this landscape format, which is quite unusual for a portrait, to encompass all of these different things arranged in the corner, and also to accommodate him and his pretty bulky cloak and personality.
Larger than life.
Exactly. And then we move over here to the drama of the 17th century with Judith with the head of Holofernes. And Judith of Bethulia decapitated Holofernes with his own sword. He was an Assyrian general in order to save her hometown. And what I think is so wonderful is the way that the drama of this painting is conveyed without any explicit bloodshed whatsoever. But it's still pretty gruesome, the way that this head looms right into our space. And normally this painting is hung on the top tier of the picture gallery, so you lose the sense of the drama.
And this is a self-portrait of the artist, so there's that kind of self-referential thing that you get with Caravaggio, and that's a portrait of his mistress, who just, I think, ditched him following the advice of her mother, who is the...
It was an unhappy affair, I think, on his behalf, at least.
Well, it's looking quite unhappy now.
And there's a great, I think, also the drama comes from this exaggerated contrast. You've got this extraordinary golden brocade and this kind of grisly head resting against it, these tufts of his hair, and a very strong grip she's got.
The paintings in the middle room of the exhibition, were all created in the Low Countries during the 17th century. So that was the Dutch Republic and the Spanish Netherlands, present-day Belgium. And they're the more ambitious type of paintings created at this time. So commissioned portraits, ambitious landscapes, and religious paintings. Fortunately, in the arrangement, particularly of this wall, we can see the very strong relationship between 17th century Flemish and Dutch painting and 16th century Italian painting, particularly Venetian painting. So we can move from portraits by Titian and Lorenzo Lotto to these behind me by Frans Hals, Rembrandt, and Van Dyck, and see how they've learned from Titian's paint technique and how they develop that technique in their own individual ways. This room will be, I think, in everybody's mind, so dominated by Rembrandt's work that I think it's important not to forget Rubens. Not that he was a person that was easily forgotten, but he's an artist who is of such importance for British art as a whole. Here is a self-portrait which he sold directly to Charles I and has been in the collection ever since, where he's presenting himself as a courtier as well as an artist. And what I think is so striking is the brilliance of the colour that he finds in the flesh tone. So the forms are modelled, you get the sense of three dimensions, not just through light and dark, but through changes from flesh colour to brighter red in one direction and then towards yellow, towards grey, and really quite bright blue in the other direction. It gives a sort of brilliance to the quality of the surface.
Yeah, and the colours are of an intensity that you don't necessarily imagine you'd see in a human face, but we read it as such. That a really intense blue in the corner of his eye, and coral as well along his eyelashes. And
another thing that Rubens does is he gives every feature a slight wave or a bit of a wobble, or it's almost like vibrato with the singer, which gives this feeling of animation to the expression of the face.
Yeah, absolutely. In the kind of nose, the way the light hits the nose as well, but it really brings him to life.
And I'm sure his beard didn't sweep and wave in that elegant way in real life, but it's
quite a mannered moustache.
So this is Rubens's pupil, Van Dyck, painted at the beginning of his career when he was working in Rubens's studio, and you see the same use of very, very brilliant colour in the flesh tones, these strong blues that you were mentioning, but you also see the way in which different flesh colours expresses the different characters of the people in the story. So the unfortunate paralytic is sick and therefore has this sallow colour associated with his rather gnarled and old and decrepit-looking physiognomy, in contrast to Christ, who's obviously a rather more blooming character.
Yeah. And taken to the extreme by the figures in the background waiting to be healed, who are so grey and brown that they almost disappear.
It's a great thing in religious painting of this date to give you a sense of the range of humanity, from the most mundane and unfortunate, the blanket in the foreground, these realistic details, as well as obviously the more elevated. And somebody, I think it was a Franciscan, when giving alms to a beggar, said, "The smell of Christ." The point being that Christ's humanity was the most important thing, and you've definitely got the smell of Christ here in this scene.
And another painting which really benefits being seen up close, because the figures really loom towards us, not just the smell, but also the hands. We really get a sense of their presence.
And they're sort of reaching out to touch it.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. This is how Rubens worked. Rather than making black and white drawings for his larger compositions, he painted oil sketches, so he worked immediately in colour, which he gave to his studio to turn into works of 4 or 5 times the scale of the oil sketch itself. And the thing that, to me, that is amazing is not that there are lots of changes in this work. Obviously they're going to be, it's a work in progress. To me it's amazing how complete it is, how realized and finished.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at it as a completed, a work of art in its own right, rather than a step within the working process.
I was looking earlier to try and find the number of cherubs in the heavens, particularly the ones that are kind of lost in the clouds, and I actually couldn't count them. And I thought, how would it be worth his while doing that level of detail just in an oil sketch? And because he can, I think.
Yeah, and it gives us an extraordinary impression of kind of just magnificence and overblown madness.
I think they'd probably say infinity rather than madness would be, but yeah, exactly. And I think you get that same feeling of richness, of excess in a good way, in these landscapes which convey the richness of nature, the fertility of nature, and where there's almost no corner where you won't find something that you didn't notice at first, hidden away in the shrubbery. As it
yeah,
were.
And everything overflowing, like this wheelbarrow that's just bursting with vegetables, with cabbages. And the extraordinary way we move from the kind of brown in the foreground to this green in the middle ground and the blue in the background, that really reminds us of an effect we see in nature.
Absolutely. And you're spilling out, those doves are heading all absolutely directly towards us. I think it feels to me like this is associated with his dream for peace in the Low Countries during his lifetime, and the fruits of peace, plenty, enough for everybody to eat, prosperity. The paintings in this room were also created in the Low Countries, the vast majority in this case in the Dutch Republic. And they're a different type of painting. They're domestic paintings, absolutely not painted for palaces, painted for ordinary homes, and generally depicting ordinary life. They fall into various categories. The study head, not commissioned portrait, the small-scale group portrait, the landscape usually without religious subject matter, depicting the Dutch Republic, the land around, and perhaps the most important and famous category, the scene of everyday life, sometimes called genre paintings, where you see usually comic episodes of ordinary life in the Dutch Republic, depicted by these famous artists, De Hoogh, Jan Steen, and Johannes Vermeer, the most famous of them all.
All but 2 of the works in this room were acquired by George IV, who was known for his magnificent collection of Dutch and Flemish masterpieces. The majority of them hung in Carlton House, his residence as Prince of Wales. And when George IV became king in 1820, he commissioned John Nash to renovate Buckingham Palace to turn it into his primary residence. As part of the plans, Nash included a picture gallery intended for the optimum display of these Dutch and Flemish paintings.
We have here an amazing wall of Dutch genre paintings, and it gives us an opportunity to ask what makes these paintings so good. And the first characteristic is so obvious in a way that it's sometimes overlooked, and that is realism, the depiction of nature. And the artist that was so famous for this is Gerrit Dou, who depicts the world with this amazing fine detail, so that every little nuance of color, every little flicker of light is picked out by his tiny, precise brush.
And there's the illusionism of the false frame around the painting and these objects projecting right into our space. We've got some salt, a bowl of lemons, this kind of cushion-like cake, and a pot of pinks, which is so close to us that we can almost smell them. And the illusionism continues with this pulled back curtain and the scene behind, which draws us even further into the painting.
So in a sense, we've got paintings about suggesting the real world. We all know about that because we know about virtual reality and digital photography and so on. But obviously paintings are not digital photographs, they're paint put on a canvas. There's a physical side to paintings. It's about a use of material. And I think in this Nicholas Mies, you can see that. Mies was a pupil of Rembrandt, and Rembrandt was the great lover of the physicality of paint. And I think you can see here how every object in the painting has a texture and a kind of substance to it. In a weird way, even the shadows seem to have a substance, and the lights.
A kind of velvety quality to the shadows, particularly in the bottom left-hand corner, which is where we see the eavesdropper indicating to us, because she's eavesdropping on this cavorting couple in the shadows.
Who are not socially distancing. So then the next characteristic, not in any particular order associated with painting, is its expressive power. It doesn't have to tell a story, but it often does want to tell a story. And here, the great master of storytelling in Dutch 17th century art is Jan Steen, and his stories are usually comedies. So here we have this wonderful tavern scene where you have this whole variety of different comic episodes, including a self-portrait of the artist cavorting in the background, a violin player, and I see him as a bit lovesick, and then these comic group of card players over on the right-hand side over here.
Yes, she's holding her ace triumphantly, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think that again, I think is such a key aspect of comedy, that you want to be part of the scene. It's something that invites an audience in. You don't want to be part of a tragedy. You do want to be part of a comedy. And then I suppose when you throw all these into the mix, you can find that there are so many variations in the way that these things can be done. So, for example, when we come here to the painters of the so-called Delft school, that's De Hoogh and Vermeer, we find that they're taking realism almost to another level, and in particular in their use of light and in their depiction of light. So here, I think one of the first times in art anywhere, somebody is depicting direct sunlight. Normally out of doors is depicted with a sort of soft diffuse light. This is wham, some light hits one place, doesn't hit another place. And it's expressed through these very, very strong primary colours.
And also the kind of geometric nature of these, the fall of light into the courtyard. This very everyday scene, a woman spinning, is elevated by his extraordinary use of light.
Absolutely, and I'm sure that these are ordinary people going about their work, but that looks to me like a very virtuous depiction of a hard-working, modest servant. So I think often in Dutch art there's a moral dimension. There's nothing very virtuous about those people in the Steen painting, but here they're definitely virtue. And then again, always really the pinnacle of any discussion of Dutch art, the work of Johannes Vermeer, where you find all these elements coming together. And I think, particularly, your point about the geometry, it has this kind of lucidity about the structure of the painting, and an amazing ability to depict space and light. So this is a painting that you feel that you don't have to just look at it, you can almost breathe it.
Yeah, and there's a particular vibrancy to this painting, which comes particularly, I think, from Vermeer's use of materials. and especially his use of one of the priciest pigments in existence at the time, ultramarine. And usually artists use it in a very intense way in a small specific part of the painting. But here Vermeer uses it everywhere. He uses it in these marble floor tiles to get exactly the right shade of black. He uses it even in the lead between the window panes, ordinarily a part of a painting that might be ignored, and even in the ceiling beams.
And that creates this effect that a very ordinary scene, everyday scene, has this jewel-like richness to it. This is a once-in-a-generation chance to see, in ideal gallery settings, some of the greatest paintings in the Royal Collection, and in fact some of the greatest paintings in the history of art. I hope it's a chance to appreciate the extraordinary work which the Conservation Department of the Royal Collection has done in conserving these works and showing them to their greatest advantage. But also, and perhaps most of all, it's a chance for you, the visitor, to make up your own mind what makes them important, what makes them masterpieces.